Greg has finally found the perfect home for himself. It was the right size, reasonably priced, and located in a quiet area, the perfect place to quietly concentrate on your home business. At 28, he was an ambitious young man. The housemates were a couple who were probably in their 50s. The man's name was Tom, and he was a cold and sullen man who frowned whenever he passed someone on the street. What woman would fall in love with such a man? Greg thought. His wife, Helen, on the other hand, was a polite woman who always smiled when she met him. Oh, what a radiant smile she had, despite her age. The mother of two adults and already married children, she still maintained good shape. It seemed that she was simply lucky with her genetics, because she hardly did any sports, but only ate right. At 52, she had a smooth face, almost without wrinkles, although gray strands were already showing through here and there. She had full breasts, which Greg never failed to notice, and a rather firm ass, the movement of which he loved to watch. "Mrs. Hopkins," Greg shouted, waving from his garden when he spotted her at the gate of the house. She had just returned from the market with an armful of groceries. "Hello, young man. How are you?" Helen responded cheerfully. "Nothing special. I trimmed the bushes in the garden." "Need help?" Greg asked, pointing to the bags Helen was clutching tightly to her chest. "Yes, it wouldn't hurt. The package is about to slip out." Greg ran over and grabbed the bag before she dropped it. He noticed beads of sweat on her forehead and neck. Even though her tank top was soaked with sweat, it still smelled good. "Please come in," Helen invited politely. This was the first time he entered their house. It was clean and cozy inside. Not surprising, though, Greg thought. Helen was always at home, and he was sure that she did the cleaning every day. "Can I take a look around?" Greg asked as Helen put away the groceries. Helen agreed, and Greg went upstairs. In one of the rooms, he saw a desk with a computer and several lockers, one of which was surprisingly unkempt. "This is my husband." "He won't let me touch his things," Helen's voice came from behind him, causing Greg to flinch slightly. "But the computer desk is so clean," he remarked. Helen laughed and explained that her husband almost never uses the computer, while she surfs the internet almost every day. "Do you have an account in Messenger or something like that?" Greg asked, leaving the room and heading into the next one. It was a bedroom. It was as clean and tidy as the living room, although the bed looked a little old for such a room. Greg stopped and stared at her. "Yes, find me at Sweet Pea is 55 on Yahoo," Helen replied. "I know this bed looks old, but I insisted Tom bring it with us when we moved here 8 years ago. It has sentimental value." Indeed, Helen loved this bed very much. This was the same bed on which she had slept with the man she loved for the last 30-odd years. This was the bed where their little children crawled into every night. It was the same bed on which their children were conceived 30 years ago. Helen smiled, remembering the past. Greg smiled back and moved into the next room. Nothing special, just a guest room with a spare bed, table, and TV. He then went downstairs and Helen followed him. "So, this is SWEETPEAS 55? Greg asked. "Right. Do you want to stay for dinner?" Helen suggested politely. "Oh no, I still have things to do at home," Greg answered, slightly succumbing to the charm of her smile. That smile is simply contagious, he thought. That night at home, Greg added Helen on Messenger and saw that she was already online. "Greg, hello, Sweet Peas. Hello, stalker. How are you?" "Greg, how did you know that I was stalking you?" "Sweet Peas, I've already been through this." "Ha, Greg, where is the husband?" "Sweet Peas, in another room. Do you want to talk to him?" "Greg, no, thanks." Greg then told Helen what he really thought about her husband. "Sweet Peas, he's not cold at all. He is very caring towards me." This was partly true. Tom was once very affectionate, but after a failed business 15 years ago, he became irritable and short-tempered. "Greg, the main thing is that you are happy, Helen." They then began discussing Greg's life and ambitions to build a successful online business. The conversation ended only at 4 o'clock in the morning. Over the next few weeks, Greg visited her neighbor from time to time. They also talked online at night, mostly about personal topics such as relationships and sex that would otherwise be awkward to talk about face to face. Greg was single for 2 years, focusing on his business. He also admitted that he liked older women and even joked that he once took Helen with him, to which she just laughed. Several times she went offline earlier than usual to serve her husband. When Greg asked how the sex was the next day, she always answered, as usual. They had an open friendship. She enjoyed his company, but was wary of getting too close to him. After all, she was a faithful wife and deeply loved her husband even after 30 years. Greg, on the other hand, lusted after her over time. Several times he caught her without a bra during the day and teased her online in the evening. She was flattered many times and wished how wonderful it would be if her husband paid so much attention to her. One day, Greg, as usual, came up, looked around, and saw a pile of clothes on the sofa. It was obvious that Helen was ironing clothes. She was wearing a loose, plain t-shirt and blue shorts. No bra at all, Greg thought. She looked sexy with her hair tied up in a bun. Water? Helen asked politely. Ice water will do, Greg answered. Helen soon returned with 2 glasses of cold water, one of which she handed to Greg. They talked a little, being very close to each other. Greg, as always, was fascinated by her beauty. Despite her 52 years, Helen looked surprisingly fresh. The gray strands in her hair only added to her special charm, and the skin on her face remained smooth and radiant. She held the glass in her hands, and her fingers slowly slid along the cold glass. Greg couldn't take his eyes off her, immersed in her image. Helen noticed this attention and smiled, feeling slightly pleased that she continued to make such an impression. What is this picture? Greg suddenly shouted, pointing in one direction. Helen turned her body and head slightly and began to explain while looking at the portrait. About. Tom bought it at a French auction last week and... Greg wasn't paying attention. Her breasts were now facing him and were bouncing up and down as she spoke enthusiastically. It's now or never, Greg thought. He lifted his glass and tipped it all the way, pouring the entire glass of ice water onto Helen's shirt. Helen shivered from the sudden cold. Now Greg took his chance. He grabbed a towel from the sofa and began to gently blot the damp fabric of Helen's shirt. His movements were fast but careful, and his gaze was focused. Helen froze for a few seconds, not immediately understanding what was happening. Everything happened so quickly that she did not have time to react. She felt a slight chill from the fabric, and her mind was momentarily clouded by the suddenness of the situation. Greg looked up and met her eyes, creating a strange tension in the air. Helen tried to sort out her thoughts. Her legs felt weak, but her whole body seemed to be filled with an electric charge. She took a deep breath, trying to pull herself together and find the right words or actions to end this moment. Greg, this is too much. Thank you. I mean, you need. I need to change, Helen said, pulling the man's hands out of her shirt. Excuse me, please. Quietly but politely, she excused herself, rushed up the stairs, ran to her room, and closed the door behind her. Greg calmly walked up the stairs, quietly opened the door, and spied what was happening inside. He saw Helen standing in front of the dressing table, looking at herself in the mirror, her hands cupping the breasts that had been touched a few minutes ago. As far as Helen was concerned, it was molestation because while she was married, she had never allowed another man to touch her like that. On the other hand, it was nice, she thought. Her husband Tom had not properly touched her breasts for about 10 years, and every love-making session was limited to just sex, and he finished the job in a maximum of 5 minutes. This is wrong. Wrong, she thought. In the mirror, she saw Greg walking towards her. Slowly, she turned and took a step back, leaning against the table. She felt Greg wrap his arms around her body and immediately melted into his arms. Greg moved closer to Helen, their faces very close, and he looked into her eyes with such intensity that her heart began to beat faster. She couldn't remember the last time Tom evoked such emotions in her, It was a whirlwind of excitement and something forbidden. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the moment take over her completely, before suddenly realizing that this was not her husband. Nuo, she screamed, breaking the kiss and turning her head away from Greg. Sorry, I thought you. Before she could finish, Greg lifted her legs off the ground and threw her onto the bed. Wow, Helen thought. She hasn't been blown away like this for a long time. The moment the man picked her up, her heart almost stopped. She was now breathing heavily and almost exhausted from what had happened so far. Greg began to remove her shorts while she recovered from the shock. Underneath was a pair of old-fashioned panties that he wasn't ready to take off at this point. Greg gently touched Helen's face, peppering her forehead, cheeks, and chin with soft kisses. His hands carefully slid along her sides, and his gaze was full of warmth and admiration. He helped her get more comfortable, carefully straightening her clothes, and for a moment pressed her to him, as if wanting to protect her from the whole world. Helen closed her eyes, enjoying the moment of closeness and the feeling of his caring touches. Greg ran his hand over her shoulder, lingering for a few seconds before meeting her gaze again. His voice was soft as he said, "You know that I will never hurt you." Helen nodded, allowing the moment to continue, trusting him completely. The atmosphere was filled with tenderness and deep understanding that did not require words. Greg ignored her requests, continuing to persistently study her reactions, not giving him the opportunity to avoid his own feelings. Helen tried to maintain composure, but her breathing was labored, and her body responded treacherously to his touch. She felt waves of heat run through her skin, and her thoughts became confused, becoming more and more blurry. She could not understand what was stronger, her desire or resistance. However, Greg's every move made her lose control. His confident actions awakened long-forgotten emotions in her, and she almost unconsciously succumbed to this, her body responding to every touch. Helen closed her eyes, trying to suppress the sensation that overcame her, but gave in when the heat inside reached its peak. Her breathing became ragged, and she involuntarily pressed closer to him. The room was filled with silence, broken only by their rapid breathing and the quiet sound of the wind outside the window. For a moment, time seemed to stop, leaving them alone with the emotions that overwhelmed them and the feeling of a deep, almost electrical connection. Helen felt a wave of deep, almost all-consuming pleasure roll over her. Her breathing was labored, and her body was trembling with overwhelming emotions. She closed her eyes, trying to stay on the edge of reality, but her thoughts stubbornly returned to Thomas. Warm touches, gentle but confident, made her forget about everything. Helen clutched the sheets, her back arched, and a strangled sound escaped from her chest. There was tension in the room, and it felt like time had stopped. When everything finally calmed down, she sank exhaustedly onto the pillows, trying to come to her senses. There was a light aroma of lavender in the air, and moonlight was shining through the curtains. Helen slowly rose from the bed. Her legs felt like they were made of cotton, and she almost lost her balance. Leaning against the edge of the nightstand, she took a deep breath and headed to the closet to change clothes. Each step was difficult, but a strange peace was visible in her gaze. Thoughts of past and present intertwined together, and she allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment, standing at the open wardrobe door. She needed time to sort out her feelings and regain her balance. Greg stood behind Helen, watching her carefully. A tense silence filled with anticipation hung between them. He came closer, leaned forward, and gently wrapped his arms around her waist, his movements confident but careful. Helen closed her eyes, trusting him completely and surrendering to the moment. Their breathing merged into a single rhythm, and the atmosphere in the room became more and more electric. Greg acted confidently, but slowly, as if studying her every movement and reaction. Helen sighed softly, her fingers digging into the soft carpet beneath her as their bodies merged in a harmonious dance. Time seemed to stand still. Every gesture, every touch was full of meaning and deep feeling. Helen felt wave after wave of emotions cover her, and she allowed herself to dissolve in this flow, without holding back her feelings. Greg held her tighter, his breathing quickened, but he didn't lose control. Their interaction was filled with tenderness and respect, and in that moment nothing existed except the two of them. When it was over, they lay next to each other, not saying a word, just enjoying the silence and closeness of each other. Helen smiled, her eyes shining with happiness and peace. Greg looked at her and gently touched her cheek, his gaze full of tenderness and warmth. "Better than your husband," Greg whispered in her ear. "Better than my husband," Helen cried, choking with pain and pleasure. Helen felt her mind gradually clouded by new, unfamiliar emotions. She had never experienced anything like this before. An exciting mixture of excitement and freedom overwhelmed her. Greg confidently guided her. Their movements merged into a single rhythm, as if they understood each other without words. He changed their situation, inviting her to take a more active role. Helen hesitantly, but with increasing enthusiasm, took the initiative. She felt different, relaxed, free from her usual framework and restrictions. With each new movement, her confidence grew, and the feeling of being in control of the situation brought a strange but pleasant satisfaction. She brushed her hair out of her face, letting it fall freely over her shoulders, and for a moment their eyes met. A whole story was read in that look, a revelation that did not require words. Helen leaned closer, touching his shoulders and feeling the warmth of his skin. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to forget about everything and just enjoy the moment that belonged only to the two of them. Greg flipped Helen over so he was on top of her, holding her arms at her sides. Their eyes met, and the air between them was filled with tension and passion. Helen leaned towards him for a kiss, but he playfully dodged and then gently touched her lips with his. Their kiss became deeper, intertwining breath and emotions. They moved to the beat, as if in harmony with an invisible melody, each gesture saying more than any words. Greg whispered something in her ear, and Helen only breathed deeply in response, clinging to him even tighter. At some point, time seemed to stop. Their breathing mingled, their hearts beat in unison, and the world around them dissolved, leaving only the two of them in this moment. Helen closed her eyes, her lips twitching into a slight smile, and Greg kissed her forehead softly. Silence reigned in the room, broken only by their intermittent breathing. Both were completely immersed in the feeling of closeness and trust that united them in this special moment. Both burst into flames in each other's arms. They gasped for fresh air and lay there for about 5 minutes. Helen looked at the alarm clock on the dressing table. It was 17:35. "God, please help me," Helen shouted, breaking away from Greg's arms. Greg kissed her on the lips, where she was now less passionate. "It's time for you to go," Helen whispered, breaking the kiss. "We can't do this again." "Can't we do this again?" Greg repeated her words. "He'll be back at 6. It's time for you to leave." "Now," she said, kissing him twice more on the lips. "Only if you promise that we will meet again." Greg tried to bargain. "We are next-door neighbors, after all," Helen thought. "Of course we will meet again. Okay, now go," Helen urged. Helen lay down on the floor as she saw the man getting dressed. "I'll lock the front door for you." "Goodbye, Helen," Greg said. Helen saw the man leave her room and heard her front door close and lock. She lay there for another 5 minutes, remembering what she had done before cleaning up the bathroom. Then she prepared dinner and waited for her husband to arrive. Helen Hopkins saw the man leave her room and heard the front door close. She was so exhausted physically and mentally that all she could do for the next few minutes was lie on the carpet. She lay exhausted in the same place where she had just had non-consensual sex with a new neighbor half her age. "Damn," she gasped, tears leaking from the corners of her eyes. Guilt overwhelmed her as she struggled to regain her composure. "It's not my fault, he made me do it," she convinced herself, remembering the insistence and pressure she felt from the new guy next door. She covered her face with her hands, sighing heavily. Memories flashed chaotically through my head, causing a storm of emotions: shame, fear, confusion. Helen felt empty, as if her body did not belong to her. She struggled to her feet and headed to the bathroom. The warm water of the shower flowed down her body, washing away not only physical traces, but also part of the emotional load. She leaned against the cold tiles, letting the tears flow freely. Her hair stuck to her face, and her breathing remained ragged. She couldn't believe this happened to her. Her thoughts rushed between self-flagellation and attempts to find an excuse. Was it all violence, or did she stop resisting at some point? This question was eating her up from the inside. The memories of the last minutes were vague, as if she was watching herself from the outside. Helen dried herself with a towel and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes showed pain, fatigue, and something she couldn't quite pinpoint. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. "I need to get ready," she whispered to herself. She had to sort out her feelings and figure out how to live further with this burden. But first, she needed to come to her senses at least a little. She quickly washed her face to prepare dinner. She had little time as her husband Tom was returning from work soon. She decided to cook something simple, some rice, fried vegetables, and eggs with the soup she had prepared in the morning. Not much, but enough, she thought. After all, Tom doesn't eat much at home these days. She finally had time to think about what happened earlier while she sat on the couch waiting for her husband to arrive. The unwanted but passionate sex she had just had was the best she had ever experienced in a long time. Greg had so much aggression and conviction, he was so confident and strong, she thought. She remembered those early days of their marriage when Tom would wake her up on Saturday mornings with tenderness and attention, spending long hours with her in cozy intimacy. Back then, she was sometimes surprised by his confident and persistent behavior, but over time she began to appreciate it as a manifestation of his love and care. About 30 years have passed since then. Now their Saturday mornings have become calm and routine: breakfast, household chores, familiar conversations. But today something has changed. She felt a long-forgotten excitement and warmth, like in those very first years of their life together. It was after the birth of Robbie's son that the lovemaking suddenly stopped, she thought. It was a difficult second birth, and Helen was unable to give birth naturally. In the end, she had to nurse her wounds for about 7 months to fully recover due to complications from the surgery, and they were unable to have the meaningful sex he craved. To make matters worse, Helen never could and never would give pleasure. Their first intimate moment was far from ideal and left Helen with awkward memories. She tried very hard, but uncertainty and anxiety took over, and everything did not go as she would have liked. Tom couldn't resist using harsh words, and this only increased her embarrassment. Since then, any such attempt has been accompanied by nervousness and fear of error. However, Helen found another way to express her affection and tenderness for her husband. Her natural charm and confidence in her physical attributes helped her compensate for her first bad experience. Tom always admired her femininity and responded with pleasure to her expressions of love. Over time, their connection strengthened, and Helen stopped dwelling on that long-ago moment, allowing the relationship to develop naturally and harmoniously. But the pain was worth it, she thought. Robbie grew up to be a fine, handsome young man. In his 20s, he was already attracting the attention of girls in college and even some of the desperate housewives in their area. Their eldest daughter, Megan, was also pretty. One day, 3 guys came to Helen to ask permission to date her daughter, but she refused each of them. She believed that Megan was still too young. But now they are all grown up. Megan moved after the wedding. God, how she missed them. Expensive. She dozed off on the sofa and woke up from a slight push from her husband. It was 20:06 on the clock. "Are you okay? Are you eating?" Tom asked. "Well, yes. No. That is, I seem to be full, so I won't eat," she answered, avoiding his gaze. When she finally looked up, she realized that he had already left for the kitchen without even waiting for the end of her sentence. "You're late today," she shouted after him. "Today is Wednesday, Helen. Meetings, remember?" Tom answered with a hint of irritation. "Oh yes, exactly. I forgot. Okay, I'll go take a shower. Just leave the dishes in the sink." "Okay." There was no answer. "I see." Helen sighed. Walking into the bathroom, Helen suddenly realized that her hair and towel were still wet because she had already taken a shower just an hour ago. However, she took off her clothes again and stood naked in front of the shower without turning on the water. She turned her head to the side and looked at herself in the mirror. "God, Helen, what have you done?" she whispered. The red kiss marks on her chest stared back at her. "Bastard," Helen gasped. Furious and confused, she began to look for ways to cover her tracks. Perhaps 30 minutes passed while she was still in the bathroom before she heard movement outside. She guessed that her husband had already had dinner and was now in the bedroom. After going through several items of clothing, Helen realized that only the same t-shirt she had worn during the day hid her breasts well enough. Confused, she left the bathroom. Thomas Hopkins lay on his bed, too immersed in his papers to notice his wife. The company he worked for sent him abroad to conduct a week-long training seminar that would help the company strengthen its position in the Asian market. He began to tell his wife that he was leaving in 2 days. "What?" Helen exclaimed. "But you didn't tell me anything." "I know," Tom answered irritably. "It was an urgent decision, Helen. Josh was supposed to fly, but his wife and daughter came down with a cold, and the doctor told them not to travel. They wouldn't send an old brat like me overseas for no reason. They simply cannot afford to pay me such a salary. Only me and Josh can handle this task. See, this could be my chance. Maybe I can find something worthwhile there and open my own business." Yes, of course, Helen thought. Over the past 15 years, Tom has continually looked for opportunities to revive his business, but none have been successful. Her husband was too old-fashioned to run a business, Helen thought. In an era when success requires money, technology, and good connections, Tom stubbornly refused to accept the advantages that technology could provide, preferring to rely on intuition and experience. True, Tom had a good network of contacts, but none of them offered him the necessary financial support. However, Helen never told him these bitter truths and always supported her husband. "Okay, then I'll pack your things for you tomorrow. I know that one day you will be successful again," Helen said as she crawled into bed with her husband, caressing his face and kissing his cheek before lying on his chest. "Come on, Helen. I need to sort out some paperwork. Why don't you go to sleep first? I'll turn off the light later," Tom said, pushing his wife away. Helen turned away with a pout, disappointed, but sighed with relief. 1 week, Helen thought, would be enough for the marks to disappear. Helen closed her eyes. It's been a long, long day. "I'm coming back late tomorrow. We have a meeting before departure," Tom said suddenly. "Uh-huh," Helen breathed. "Oh," she sighed, nervously predicting what would happen next. "I've been so stressed these few days. I need to rest, baby. Could you give me something?" Tom asked politely this time. "Damn," Helen signed under her breath, nervously tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Her husband was again hinting at intimacy. Well, some of the hints were clearer than glass. "We need to come up with something urgently, Helen Hopkins, urgently." The room became darker. Someone turned off the table lamp. Tom extended his hand to his wife and pulled her closer to him. There was anticipation in his gaze, and his smile was content and slightly sly. He always counted on her understanding and attention at such moments. Helen sighed, suppressing a slight smile, and settled down next to him, hugging her husband. Sometimes family warmth lies precisely in such simple but important moments. Helen searched the room. It was completely dark. The curtains were closed, protecting the room from the moonlight. In one smooth, cunning movement, she pulled her t-shirt over her head, exposing her full breasts for the second time that day. She carefully climbed onto the bed and settled comfortably next to him. Her movements were smooth and confident, and her gaze was full of tenderness. With a light touch, she ran her fingers over his chest, feeling the warmth of his skin. Tom smiled at her, his hand finding hers, intertwining their fingers. There was a silence between them, filled with trust and intimacy. Her breathing slowed, and her heart beat evenly and calmly. "Tom," she whispered quietly, looking into his eyes. "Helen," he said softly, his voice low and warm. They lay there for a long time, enjoying each other's presence. There was affection in their glances, tenderness in their touches, and wordless understanding in every movement. Their world had narrowed to this moment, where it was just the two of them. Helen laid her head on his chest, closed her eyes, and smiled. Tom ran his hand through her hair, feeling its softness and silkiness. "You're still the most amazing," he whispered. Helen didn't answer, she just pressed closer to him. In this silence they found peace, harmony, and something that did not require words. Time seemed to freeze, leaving them a moment just for the two of them. Her husband's words continued to ring in her head like an echo, echoing with pain in her heart. She tried to comprehend them, to find some hidden meaning in them, but it was all in vain. Her breathing became unsteady, and she had to take deep breaths to calm down and continue moving forward. Her hands were shaking, and her thoughts were confused, like a ball of thread that could not be untangled. She closed her eyes, trying to find the strength to overcome this moment. Her husband's voice still sounded in her memory, his words burned, leaving a mark on her soul. "Honey, just be here," Tom said, his voice soft, but at the same time filled with weariness. She nodded, trying to focus on their connection, on the fact that there was still something important between them. Tom looked at her with a slight smile that hid his underlying concern. "You're nearby, and that's the main thing," he added. Helen felt the tension ease a little. She took a deep breath and met her husband's gaze. Their silence spoke more than any words. Sometimes it is in moments like these that people realize how important they are to each other. She squeezed his hand, and Tom returned the gesture. At that moment, an understanding reigned between them, fragile but real. They both knew that there were still many obstacles ahead, but for now, just being near each other was enough for them. "That's it, Helena, oh hell yes." Tom breathed a sigh of relief, clearly pleased. He put his arm around his wife's shoulders, the first sign of affection he'd shown tonight, and moved closer to her. Helen pressed herself tightly to him, anticipating closeness. Tom moaned softly, and Helen felt their connection growing stronger. "Ah, ah," he muttered. He let go of his wife and, feeling completely satisfied, quickly fell asleep. Helen took the t-shirt lying next to her, carefully dried herself, and put it on the carpet. She then snuggled into her husband's arms, enjoying the moment of peace. "I'm so sorry," she apologized quietly. He was clearly asleep. But these words did not stop sounding in her head. "Helen, you're still the best at it." Still, the best? Did her husband compare her breasts to another woman's breasts? Did he sleep with anyone else? Or was she just too sensitive? My husband's phone suddenly beeped. Not wanting to wake her tired husband, Helen reached for the phone and pressed the button to turn it off. By chance, she read a message on the notification screen. "Baby, will we meet before your flight? You'll miss me, I know. Come and I'll blow up your body, baby. Come early and wake me up." Her fears were confirmed. Helen did not sleep, but did not get out of bed until her husband left for work. She spent the whole night guessing about who this woman was who would blow up her husband's body. Early in the morning, in an empty house, she fell on the bed again and began to cry. In the last 24 hours, her life had collapsed. After spending 2 hours feeling sorry for herself, Helen began to gather her strength, continuing to blame herself for everything that had happened. As a married woman, she shouldn't have gotten so close to the young guy next door, even if he was old enough to be her son. She thought their friendship was innocent, but she should have known better. She was a bad wife, Helen thought. If she had the same talent in handling a man's manhood with her mouth as she does with her breasts, her husband would not go to another woman to satisfy him. She was wrong, it was all her fault, and she couldn't stop feeling sorry for herself. She had to fix what she had destroyed, Helen decided. She began making a to-do list. First, she had to talk to that same neighbor and make sure that this would never happen again. She was willing to threaten him to achieve this. "If you come near me one more time, if you touch me one more time, I will go to the police. I will tell the whole community. No, I will tell my husband, and he is a tough nut to crack, you know." Helen rehearsed. Now the second one, learn to make fun. The simple process is to create intimacy and please your man. Helen swallowed. It had been perhaps 35 years since her young lover Thomas had looked forward to their first moment together, and she had failed then. She started searching the internet for advice on improving relationships and read articles that seemed easier in words than in reality. She needed video instructions. She remembered Greg telling her in Messenger about a site with useful materials that he often visited. "Okay, let's go," Helen whispered as she entered the site. Helen sighed as she saw how the modern idea of intimacy had changed. She immediately began to look for advice on how to improve the relationship. There, she found many recommendations on how ordinary women, wives, and girlfriends, just like her, can bring joy to their men. She trained all day, completing various tasks and focusing on herself, and felt confident. That night, she took the first step towards her husband. "You're kidding, honey. Last time we were close, you bit me, remember?" Tom answered, pulling the blanket up and turning on his side. These words hurt Helen. She tried so hard to make amends, but was rejected and felt like a failure. She turned over on her side and fell asleep. She's tired. The next morning, her husband had already left for the airport when Helen woke up. Still feeling dejected from how her husband had rejected her the previous evening, she walked to the window and opened the curtains, as she always does every morning. Anger slowly grew inside her as she looked at the house that belonged to this man. She ran out of the house and knocked hard on her neighbor's door. "Greg, we need to talk. Open the door." Greg opened the door and greeted her with a smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Hopkins." Bastard, Helen thought. Look at his grin. What did he call me? Mrs. Hopkins? Is he kidding me? "Let's talk inside," Helen said, pushing her way inside. "What you did to me was very, very wrong. It was a crime. Don't even dare do that again. Don't even try. Or, I'll tell my husband. You wouldn't want to get involved with my husband." Helen managed to speak out. "Right," was all Greg responded, speechless. She didn't tell her husband, which means she probably never will, he thought. "We will have no problem contacting the police. You will be caught and tried. Do you want to go to jail?" Helen threatened. "No, ma'am," Greg replied, startled and confused. "But you can redeem yourself by doing what I'm about to teach you." Helen continued. "If you do as I tell you, nothing will happen to you. Now it's all up to you." "Got it?" Helen said, trying to hide her nervousness. "What?" Greg asked in surprise. "You will teach me." "How?" "How to please," Helen said nervously. "What?" Greg blurted out the first word that came to mind. "You heard me, young man. If you teach me how to give pleasure, I won't tell anyone what you did to me. If you don't agree to this, I'll call the police. Deal or no deal," Helen said, trying her best to look convincing. "Why do you need to learn how to please?" Greg said, confused. "I don't need to study. I want to master the skills that I already have." Helen started to get nervous again. "Do you want to master the skills of giving pleasure? And do you need my help?" Greg got really curious. He couldn't believe his luck. "Rule number 1, no questions asked. Rule number 2, I will tell you later. So deal or prison," Helen said, firmly believing that she was in control. "Deal, deal. Of course, deal," Greg said, still wondering how he hit that jackpot. "So how do we do this?" he asked. "Well, I give you tasks and you give me feedback. You tell me what I'm doing right, what I'm doing wrong, how I can do it better. You talk about how important it is for a woman. To go. You share how I feel when I do it and give instant feedback on how to do it." Helen answered, pacing around the room. "Do you need me to come up with a lesson plan?" Greg chuckled. "Oh, do whatever you think is necessary, as long as I get what I want. Oh, by the way, if you try to delay the process of completing tasks, I will notice it, and the consequences will be serious. You have 1 month. No, 2 weeks for me to become an expert in this field," Helen said sternly. "Yes, madam. Then you will achieve your goal. When will we start?" asked Greg. "Whenever I want. You must be ready. I'll come later," Helen said, leaving the house. She was pleased with how she managed this conversation and how she was in complete control of the situation. Greg was in dreamland. For the last few weeks, he had been planning to get under her skirt. He managed to achieve this, but now he has a chance to make her his girlfriend of easy virtue, giving pleasure. Unknown to Helen, he had been following her every move for the past few weeks, studying her lifestyle. Through their online chats, he also found out her husband's schedule. He chose Wednesday to attack because he knew Tom returned late every Wednesday. He took the video camera from the table, took out the SD card, and put it in the safe. "You're not needed yet," he said, smiling, looking at the memory card. He patted the video camera gently, remembering how he had cleverly placed it on the side table in Helen's room, filming every second of their romps. This was the insurance he always sought to obtain for his victims. To Helen, at least until yesterday, Greg was an honest young man who gently coaxed her into having sex with him. In fact, Greg deliberately preyed on mature housewives, filmed their sexual acts, and blackmailed them. He has lost count of the number of neighbor wives he has had, but this neighbor is becoming too good, too easy. He sat down in a chair and began planning the right approach. Helen sat on the sofa for several hours after returning from the house next door. She reflected on her relationship with her husband and imagined ways to spend time together. She mentally rehearsed moments of intimacy, trying to be more attentive and caring. She imagined herself keeping in touch and being caring to please Thomas. "She'll do anything to please Thomas," she told herself. 2 hours later, Helen found herself standing outside her neighbor's door and took a deep breath before knocking on his door. "Wait!" she heard Greg scream. She felt nervous as she stood outside for more than a minute. She hoped that none of the neighbors saw her standing near the house of a young, lonely man. She knocked again. "Sorry." Greg looked apologetic at the door. "Please come in." Helen came in relieved. "You know, I could call. I was busy doing something. I didn't expect you to come back so soon." Greg tried to say this with slight annoyance. "Do you need me to come back later?" Helen stuttered, feeling apologetic. "No, it's okay. I need a break. I wouldn't mind having an attractive lady like you during my break," Greg said charmingly, running his fingers over her face. "Rule number 2, don't talk sweetly to me." Helen blushed. "Rule number 3, don't touch me." Helen turned away, her heart now racing. "Ha, let me clean up. And then, we can get started." Greg apologized. Helen heard the sound of the shower and the sound of water falling on the floor, sat down on the sofa, and tried to come to her senses. Greg, on the other hand, was in no hurry. He deliberately kept Helen waiting. When the time came, he dried himself off and walked into the living room with a towel hanging around his neck. Helen couldn't keep her lips closed as she gazed in fascination at the toned, naked body of her younger neighbor walking towards her. "Now we can begin," Greg said, standing naked in front of Helen. "What do you want me to do?" Helen looked at Greg, but tried not to look him in the eyes. "Do what you would do to your Thomas," Greg said quietly. Helen reached out to support the young man, touching him gently with her hand. She slowly ran her hand along it several times until Greg felt more confident. She then gently touched his shoulders while touching his arm at the same time. She looked at Greg, waiting for his reaction. "Very nice," Greg whispered, impressed. They were still sitting on the sofa, and Helen positioned herself so that they were closer to each other. At this moment, she began to get nervous because she did not always manage to feel confident in such situations. She continued to gently support him, wondering what to do next. "Let's continue," Greg whispered. Helen looked into his eyes. I'm not sure, she thought, but she liked the attention he gave her. Feeling supported, Helen leaned forward slightly and opened herself up to intimacy. Greg supported her, gently touching her shoulders, and they continued to spend time together, enjoying the moment. "Whoa," Greg said quietly, feeling a special warmth and connection between them. Helen, feeling encouraged, approached Greg again and touched him gently. She mentally thought through her actions, as if she were watching a movie, and began to communicate tenderly with him. She then stood up from the couch, knelt down and placed her hands on his thighs and buttocks to better control the situation. She supported him and began to gradually approach. Helen moved slowly, watching her movements carefully, and then picked up the pace. Greg remained calm, so she tilted her head back and looked up. Helen saw Greg relax, close his eyes, and take a deep breath. She felt hot and undid a few buttons on her dress, feeling more free. She continued to take care of him, showing attention and tenderness. Greg was delighted to watch Helen. He felt strong emotions and enjoyment of the moment. Helen looked up again and met Greg's gaze. She noticed how he was breathing heavily and expressing his feelings. She touched him softly, creating a cozy atmosphere. "That's all. I'm already ready. Baby, you're so good. You're so good. Good girl. Good girl. You're, oh, so good. Ah, ah." Greg groaned, instinctively hugging Helen and showing his feelings. Greg opened his eyes, looking at the ceiling, and felt relieved. It was by far one of the best moments he had ever experienced. Was she kidding when she said she needed a coach, he thought. He looked down and saw Helen dealing with her emotions. She tried to remain calm and then smiled at Greg. She wiped her lips and chin and looked at him warmly. "How did it go?" Helen asked impatiently. "Damn cool," Greg thought. Now he looked closely at Helen. He looked at an elegant woman who looked good despite being a little older. She had just experienced intense emotions that left a mark on her face and in her memory. She was wearing a regular dress with long sleeves, the type worn by many modest older women. She probably undid the top few buttons of her dress to freshen up, revealing her pale, smooth cleavage. 2 days ago, Greg noticed a mark on her neck that he left on purpose. What an amazing woman, Greg thought. A lovely old lady who once did not seek such experiences, but now wants to learn to understand herself better. She is in the process of change and self-discovery. "The bathroom is over there," Greg said, pointing in a direction, still shocked at how nice it was. Helen went to the bathroom to freshen up, and Greg lowered his sweaty, naked body onto the sofa. "So how did it go?" Helen shouted from the bathroom. "It was good," Greg responded, refraining from saying it was great. "You bit me. That was bad. Needs more practice," he continued. He was clearly lying. "What?" Hearing this, Helen ran out of the bathroom, feeling surprised and a little disappointed. She tried her best not to use her teeth, she thought. "Yes, you did it. Need to practice more. Come again tomorrow," Greg commanded. "Well, young man, don't tell me when to come." Helen pulled herself together and became more authoritative. "I decide when I come, whenever I want," she continued, cautiously approaching Greg. "I'll come back tomorrow after dinner for more practice. Tom is going on a business trip for a week. Otherwise," said Helen. "Otherwise? What?" Greg chuckled. "Keep pretending, bastard," Greg thought. "Otherwise, Tom and I will go to the police because of what you did 2 days ago," Helen threatened naively. Greg stood up and walked over to Helen. "But you enjoyed every second, didn't you?" He grabbed her waist and pressed against her, touching her lightly, leaving traces of his presence on her dress. He kissed her on the lips, which she reciprocated by opening her mouth and touching his tongue with hers. Then she pushed him away. "Tomorrow at 8 o'clock, no more words," Helen said, walking out the door as Greg contemplated his next move. After leaving Greg, Helen returned home. The house was quiet, too quiet. She sat down on the sofa and covered her face with her hands. A hurricane of emotions raged inside: shame, guilt, fear, and bitter disappointment in myself. Several hours passed. She took a shower, cooked dinner, and sat down to wait for Tom. When he returned, they ate dinner in almost complete silence. Tom talked about his plans for a business trip, about work, about his worries. Helen listened, nodding and smiling occasionally, but her thoughts were far away. "Everything is fine?" Tom finally asked, looking up from his plate. "Yes, just tired." Helen smiled faintly. That night she could not sleep for a long time. The words that she so wanted to say were spinning in her head, but were stuck in her throat. The next morning, Tom left on a business trip. When the door closed behind him, Helen realized that she had a week to understand herself and make a choice. Helen did not respond to Greg's messages and avoided his gaze when he went out into the garden or stood at the window. She decided to focus entirely on herself and her marriage. She went through old photographs with Tom, reread their correspondence from many years ago, and remembered how they loved each other. She realized that their relationship was slowly fading away not because of either of them, but because of their mutual indifference. One evening, she plucked up courage and wrote Tom a message. Tom, I want to talk to you when you get back. About us. About what went wrong and how we can fix it. I love you. Please give us a chance. Tom answered briefly, Of course, honey. I want to talk too. See you on Friday. Helen served dinner and put on the same dress that Tom had always loved. She greeted him at the door with a sincere smile and warm gaze. Tom looked tired, but his eyes glowed with warmth. I missed you, he said, hugging his wife. After dinner, they sat in the living room for a long time and talked. For the first time in years, they spoke for real. Helen opened her soul to Tom. She told him how lonely she felt, how she lacked attention and support. She didn't mention Greg, but she made it clear that she was on the verge of making a mistake. I was wrong too, Helen. I was consumed by work and my failures. I forgot that next to me there is the most wonderful woman in the world. Tom took her hand, and they sat in silence for a long time, just enjoying being together. Several months have passed. Helen and Tom went on a short trip together for the first time in many years. They both changed. We became more attentive to each other, began to talk more often about our feelings and support each other. As for Greg, he sold the house and moved out of the area. Helen avoided any contact with him. She decided to leave the past in the past and move forward. Sitting on the seashore next to Tom, Helen smiled and thought, mistakes can happen to anyone. The main thing is to recognize them in time and do everything to correct the situation. Tom put his arm around her shoulders, and together they looked at the horizon, where the sun was slowly disappearing behind the waterline. And subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.